All right, everyone, welcome in. Welcome to today's webinar, Nurturing Young Eaters, Empowering Dietitians to Support Hispanic Families. We're thrilled to have all of you join us. My name is Lauren Pena. I'm a registered dietitian with Dairy Management West. And here are some learning objectives today that are going to be covered over the next hour, and everyone will have access to these slides as well. And here are the disclosures for both of our speakers. We are so thrilled to have both Dr. Beth Widen and Marina Chaparro join us today. This webinar was made possible thanks to the collaborative efforts of National Pork Board's Pork and Partners, Washington State Dairy Council, Dairy Management West, Arizona Beef Council, and Dairy West. And our first speaking session is led by Dr. Beth Widen. Dr. Beth Widen is a registered dietitian and associate professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Widen's laboratory aims to improve nutrition and health during pregnancy, infancy, and early childhood through novel behavioral interventions and longitudinal studies, particularly among families at high nutritional risk. Dr. Widen has received many accolades, including the Norman Kretschner Memorial Award in Nutrition and Development from the American Society for Nutrition, and a mid-career award from the Community and Public Health Nutrition Research Interest section of the American Society for Nutrition. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Beth Widen.
Hi. Well, thank you everyone for being here and for attending, and thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of my research and some of my lab's work on early infant feeding and the role of animal source foods in relation to healthy growth and development. I'll broadly talk about, well, why are we interested in infants and young children? Then we'll review current recommendations and then really go into detail about how we're actually doing, looking at results from the FIT studies and then also NHANES. And then I'll talk about some preliminary findings from my laboratory's Magic Feeding trial, where I'll specifically talk about the role of animal source foods in relation to infant dietary quality, and then looking at some of the relationships between animal source foods and infant health outcomes. So first, why focus on these first 1,000 days? And so I'll be talking specifically about early life nutrition. And as we all know, early life nutrition really has lasting implications for health, and then it also sets the stage for lifelong health. The first 1,000 days is from conception to child age 2. And so we know that malnutrition during this time has really lasting implications. We know that it can affect pregnancy outcomes and birth outcomes, including cardiometabolic risk for the pregnant individual, but then also for their child. And then we also know that being exposed to malnutrition, including underweight or obesity, can also have lasting implications for child development, growth, and obesity risk. So we also know that this period is really important time for when providers can actually work with parents and caregivers to actually help improve health of children. And so that's why I'm here today to talk about it. We also know that this first 1,000-day period is a time of really rapid growth. And so we know that healthy infants grow in a predictable manner. And so they follow this typical pattern of growth that we see in both weight and then length and then also head circumference. We also know that normal growth is what we call saltatory or pulsative, where we have these periods of really rapid growth followed by periods of no measurable growth. And then we also know that we have a gradual change in body proportions over time. So when a baby is born, they're very large head, very large torso, very tiny little limbs. And then as they grow and have this really rapid growth during infancy, we see this really gradual change in how their limbs relative to their torso are changing over time. So we know that linear growth is really the most rapid in the first few months of infancy, slowing at 6 months and then becoming even slower after 12 months. And so during this really rapid growth period in that first year, we see typically on average a doubling of birth weight by 5 months and then tripling of birth weight by a year. We also see a 50% increase in length, and by age 5, length has doubled from birth length. And then we also see a really large increase in head circumference with almost a 40% increase in head circumference during this first year period. Some other features about growth that I find really fascinating are that among older children, we also see changes in growth velocities having seasonal variation. So basically, we see sometimes higher velocities in spring and summer among children after that infancy period. So we have this really rapid change in body size and body length, and this rapid increase in head circumference. But what does this head circumference mean? So the head circumference changes are reflecting a really vast array of brain development happening across this first 1,000-day period. So this figure is from the Lancet from 2007, and it highlights human brain development across the life course, starting at conception and then ending actually at death. And so let's zero in on this 1,000-day period, which is from conception to child age 2. So here, at the beginnings of, soon after conception, we have the beginnings of neurulation. And then we have cell migration, and then the development of the prefrontal cortex. And then here at birth, we begin to see the beginnings of seeing and hearing, and then receptive language. And then we also see the beginnings of higher cognitive function coming into play here. So then if we shift back out to the life course, we can see how this 1,000-day period has really lasting implications for brain development and then cognition throughout the life course. So now we know that this 1,000-day period is important. Well, what is currently recommended for infant and toddler feeding? And so today I'm going to highlight both how to feed and then also what to feed. Okay, so you'll see throughout the literature, there's actually a recommendation for responsive feeding. And responsive feeding is when caregivers respond appropriately to their infant's cues of both hunger and fullness, and then also do not pressure the infant to eat food. And we also know that responsive feeding fosters a really positive infant caregiver relationship. We also know that there's a growing interest in different types of feeding approaches for infancy, where there's traditional weaning, which is typically with spoon feeding, or baby-led weaning, which is when the feeding is more baby directed. And then there's mix, which is a mix of between the two. But interestingly, there's very little empirical research actually on whether either of these feeding approaches or the mixed feeding approach can have some positive outcomes. And so if you actually look at the AAP or the dietary guidelines, they don't actually say anything specifically about feeding approach, but they do say that responsive feeding is important, but actually how to do that is really quite tricky. So then if we move and shift over to the USDA food patterns, so what to feed baby. So one of the most striking things about the early infancy period is that there's no specific dietary pattern that's recommended at this age, really other than encouraging a variety of foods. The goal here is really setting the stage for meeting the toddler food patterns. And instead of focusing on specific foods and specific quantities of foods, the recommendations highlight some key nutrients, particularly iron and zinc, as being important during this period. There's some then more specific recommendations for if infants are consuming only breast milk and no complementary foods, including feeding infant cereal while continuing to breastfeed after 6 months in order to ensure that babies are receiving iron. And then if babies having breast milk and then also complementary foods, prioritizing fruits and vegetables, particularly those rich in potassium, vitamin A, and vitamin C. Then if we shift to the 12-month period, there's specific recommendations based on whether the baby is having breast milk or formula or not. And so basically, once babies are off of breast milk or formula, the recommendations then begin to say, including a variety of nutrient-rich animal source foods, including meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, dairy, nuts or seeds, fruits, vegetables, and grains. And then also we have the textures coming into play more. And then recommendation for transitioning from formula to whole milk, and then having a variety of foods, including the small portions of families' meals. But there is a gap, actually, in my opinion, in terms of the detailed insight needed to actually feed babies from 6 to 12 months and what is actually appropriate and what helps them meet those specific nutrient recommendations. We know that certain foods are higher in iron and zinc, so meats and fortified cereals. We also know that a nutrient-dense diet during this period also is recommended to be high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, which include eggs and olive oils and oily fish. or PUFAs that are as additives in infant formula. And then we also know that a variety of fruits and vegetables and also whole grains, and then introducing peanuts and eggs after 4 months, which is in line with the current allergy recommendations. So these are the current recommendations, but then what are we actually doing? Are we actually meeting them? And so first, do y'all think that we're on track to meeting these patterns? If you can, I don't know if we can actually do a Q&A here, but long story short, we're not really doing great at all with meeting these patterns at 12 months. And let's dive in a little bit into how well babies are eating. Okay, so these are data from FITS from 2018, looking at babies' intake of complementary foods from a 24-hour recall. And basically, these are intake of foods prior to 6 months. Then we have intake of foods at 6 months to 9 months, and then 9 to 11 months. And so let's just zero in over here with the 9 to 11 month period. And so if we look specifically at the percent consuming on a given day, for cereal, about 50% were consuming cereal on a prior day. About 70% vegetables, almost 80% fruits. And then if we look at meats and proteins, we're doing woefully inadequate with only 50% consuming meats or proteins. And then we ideally, we are seeing lower consumption of juice and sweets, but still that's a little bit higher than ideal. So really lots of room for improvement there in terms of actually having any consumption of these foods on a prior day. So then let's zero in specifically at looking at protein foods. And so if we zero in and look in more detail, at the 9 to 11 month period, only about 40% of babies had meat or protein in a prior day. And so if we zero in and look specifically at what this means, 4% of them were having baby food meats. About a quarter were having meats that weren't baby food, so like table food in an appropriate texture for baby. And then about a quarter were having meat or protein from another protein source, including eggs, cheese, or yogurt. And then I just kind of want to highlight here that if we're thinking specifically about iron, which is a really important food that's highly recommended, there's really drastic differences based on babies' feeding type in terms of milk feeding. And so these are data from FITS looking at breastfed infants, mixed-fed and formula-fed infants, and where they're getting their iron from and how much iron they're getting. And so basically, what you can see here is that most of the formula-fed infants, the majority of the iron that they're receiving is non-heme with a tiny proportion from heme. And then the proportions shift as we go back towards breastfeeding. But what I want to highlight here from this work is that taking that data and then looking at how much iron is being consumed and then looking at specific feeding types, breastfed infants are not eating enough iron. Almost, so 95% of them are not meeting the EAR for iron across that complementary feeding period. Mixed-fed infants are also not doing very well. So this means that they're having a little bit of iron from formula, but not a lot. And then formula-fed infants, 20% of them are still not meeting the requirements for iron during the infancy period, highlighting a lot of room for improvement. Let's now zero in on toddlers. Okay, so these are data from NHANES that were highlighted in the 20 to 2025 dietary guidelines. And so we see, so infancy, we're not doing that great. Toddlers, these are the recommended intake ranges here in this teal color, and then the average intakes in toddlers is in this purple here. So toddlers are doing really well they're doing well above what's recommended for dairy. They're doing well above recommended for total grain, well above recommended for fruits. Vegetables, a little bit low. Protein, maybe slightly low, but almost there. And then if we zero in and look specifically at food groups, let's look at the protein foods and the specific protein food categories. So we're right on target for toddlers for that protein recommendation in terms of ounce equivalents per day. But then if we specifically look at the different groups, so the average intakes for meats and poultries are above the recommended ranges. For eggs, they're right below. For seafood, it's far below. And then we're on target for nuts, seeds, and soy. Okay. Then if we think overall about how well are toddlers eating, these are the Healthy Eating Index scores by age group. And so the earliest ones that we have calculated at the time of when this came out were for age 2. We now have the ability to calculate them for younger infants, but it's just not been done in this NHANES data. But I want to highlight here that even though we're not doing that great, the ages 2 to 5 group actually have the highest dietary healthy eating index scores compared to the older children. So just want to highlight that even though we're not doing that great, these kids still might be actually eating quite well relative to their older peers. So now, one of the reasons why this might be is because feeding infants is confusing. There's a lot of information out there about how to feed babies, which we'll go into a little bit, and you'll hear from Marina about. And there's just a lot of confusion about what to feed infants. And then also we just got dietary guidelines for this age group in 2020. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent advances in infant nutrition intervention research, including some of my lab's work about responsive feeding and sensitive caregiving, and then also including mothers and other caregivers. And so the trial that I lead here at UT Austin is called the Mothers and Caregivers Investing in Children. We have 3 versions of this trial. And right now I'll be talking about our first trial, which is our virtual intervention, where we compared our magic feeding intervention to a safety control arm. And we focus on both how to feed and then also what to feed, including an appropriate introduction of complementary foods with an emphasis on animal source foods, including beef, eggs, pork, and then all of the other animal source foods, including dairy. Then also touching on responsive feeding and parenting. We do a really cool video feedback coaching where we show caregivers videos of themselves feeding their babies, and then we actually give them positive feedback on what they did well during the feeding. So the intervention includes infographics and a website. And so this is just an image of one of our infographics showing what are the cues that we should see for babies when we're starting solids, so sitting up and leaning forward, and then what can be an appropriate first food for baby. And so basically we think that all foods, as long as they're not honey in their appropriate texture, could be a first food for baby. And then Magic uniquely has an animal source food emphasis. And so my idea for Magic came from working in low and middle income settings for many years and learning about animal husbandry studies in these settings, finding that that provision of eggs or provision of rabbits or other animal source foods can increase capacity for feeding infants, but then also support growth and development. But there's really several gaps in our understanding of animal source foods in infancy, particularly how they're introduced, the patterns of intake, and then whether certain foods contribute to diet quality or infant growth, and then cognitive outcomes. And then few of the studies have actually been done in the context of overall diet. So first, I'll talk about some preliminary results from our MAGIC trial, including how animal source foods contribute to dietary quality. And this work is led by my doctoral student, Sarah Lynn Foster, as part of her doctoral dissertation. So in the MAGIC trial, we assessed diet at many different time points across infancy with a 24-hour dietary recall, along with an infant-based feeding food frequency questionnaire. And then we calculated diet quality based on an index that's available that doesn't include animal source foods in it, and looked at this across the infancy period. So these are results from our multivariable linear regression looking at how different animal source foods in the sample of 71 that we had analyzed at the time of this related to infant dietary quality. And so basically what I'm showing here is that if infants were ever consumers of poultry or egg or beef, they had higher scores on the infant dietary quality infant. So that means just ever consumption of poultry, egg, and beef is associated with higher levels of dietary quality among the infants. So now, what does this diet quality mean? Are there certain foods that actually contribute to cognition or growth in our sample? Basically, we were interested in looking at, well, are consumers of animal source foods different than non-consumers? And so we found that basically being an ever consumer of pork across that entire infancy period was associated with a slightly higher trend towards having a higher score on this deferred imitation task, which is assessing working memories in those babies at 12 months. We're actually still coding the task, and we actually still have babies flowing through our study. So we're going to look more at this in the future. So this is considered a preliminary finding. We also found that being an ever consumer of pork wasn't associated with weight or length. We found that being a beef consumer versus not wasn't associated with memory, weight, or relative size, weight for length at baby age 12 months. And then similarly, we found that egg consumption was not associated with memory, weight for age, or weight for length. And so these are all based on the data that was coded as of baby age 12 months. So to take away from this work, so basically I highlighted here and then through some of our evidence is that from the MAGIC trial is that animal source foods are ideal first foods that contribute positively to infant dietary quality. We strikingly found no really major differences between consumers or non-consumers of animal source foods for infant growth or infant memory. And so as a next step in what we're going to be doing over the next 6 months or so is to actually more granularly look at dietary intake and dietary quality in relation to these outcomes, and then looking at the role of animal source foods and diet quality together in relation to these outcomes. We also think that it's really important to focus on supporting both iron and then also protein needs. And I think it's important to highlight here that we really want to make sure that particularly among breastfed infants, after they switch from formula to for breastfed infants, and then also after that switch from formula to cow's milk, making sure that infants and toddlers have really high or have really adequate intakes of iron-rich foods. I also want to highlight here that while toddlers seem to be doing pretty well for protein, infants might not be doing as well, but actually trying to piece that apart is something that we're hoping to do in the lab pretty soon to see if we're actually adequate for protein intake across infancy. And it does get a little bit tricky in terms of studying diet in infants, is that there's a lot of variability in the amount of protein that infants are consuming depending on the intensity of their breastfeeding or formula feeding, and then also as they continue to accept increasing amounts of complementary foods. There's quite a lot of variability from my personal experiences as a caregiver, but then also as a researcher working with families in seeing the level of milk consumption, whether from formula or breast milk or from uh, or from complementary foods, really quite variable as babies accept increasing amounts of complementary foods at different ages. So for example, my daughter, who's now 5, really didn't accept very many complementary foods until she was much closer to age 1. But then for my son, who's a little bit older than her, he was eating so much food in right around 7 months, and then continue to eat a ton of food around 7 months. And so their relative contribution of complementary foods to their overall diet and diet quality, which is including milk during the infancy period, was really quite different. I also want to highlight that that basically thinking about how to support caregivers and families in helping their babies meet the protein requirements and iron requirements and nutrient density requirements across infancy, I think it's really important to focus on textures and shapes, and just ensuring that as providers, we try to help families feed their babies appropriate foods and the appropriate texture that are also culturally relevant for their families. I forgot to mention that the MAGIC trial included about 70% Hispanic families, and so our intervention, and then also all of our coaching, and then also all of our dietary intake reporting is also accounting for differences in people's dietary preferences and beliefs. And we're seeing that in a lot of the dietary data that we're currently looking at. So with that, I want to thank my co-PI, Debbie Jacobitz, and then our co-investigators on the MAGIC team, including Maria Arredondo, Marissa Burgermaster, and Ladia Hernandez, among many others. And then our staff, including Sarah and Kimberly, Ileana, Lorena, Heather, Gracia, and Juan Pablo. And then our students, Sarah Lynn, Marcella, Anna E, Madeline, Kaylee, Bea, Robert, and Aaliyah. They all are really contributing so much to the project and have contributed so much to the project. And then I'm happy to take any questions.
Beautiful. Thanks, Dr. Widen. I know it's a very, very quick presentation, but we really appreciate it. So we did see some questions come in the chat. So the first question here is from Beth. Was there a correlation between any time eaters of animal source foods and serum hemoglobin iron status in infants?
So that's a really great question. That's actually something that we're hoping to look at with our data from chart abstraction. We're still, actively following the families, and then actually getting their chart data is this whole onerous undertaking. And so that's something that we're interested in doing. We also have a new clinical trial that we've launched that is a longer version of this study where we start earlier in infancy. We start the responsive feeding coaching at baby age 3 weeks to 8 weeks instead of at baby age 6 months. So to try and begin the responsive feeding caregiver relationship earlier in infancy. And in that trial, we're actually trying to seek funding to support the iron measurements in the babies at 1 year. Doing iron measurements in babies is really hard to get blood draws, but we're hoping that we'll be able to do that.
Awesome. And then the next question we have here is the consumption of pork, could that be due to cultural preference or religion?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's actually something that we are hoping to look into in our study. So I don't think we assessed religion specifically in the sample, but we do have individuals' cultural backgrounds. And one of my doctoral students is very interested in looking at cultural preferences and how that influences early life feeding practices. We've just now almost we've completed our infancy data collection now. So we're just beginning to look at those parts of the data, but I really appreciate the question. And I think it's really important to also look at that.
Awesome. And we'll do one more real quick. So this next one is many say food before one is just for fun. How would you recommend responding to this statement?
So I think, and like as I was saying at the end of the talk, really there's a lot of variability in how much milk some infants are consuming compared to others. And so some infants probably get the majority of their nutrients and dietary intakes from milk, so from either breast milk or formula, whereas other babies really decrease the amount of formula and breast milk that they're having quite substantially and then replace that with the complementary food. So I think it's really baby specific in terms of how much food versus milk they're consuming. But also, if they are consuming less milk, then they need to replace that with high quality, nutrient dense complementary foods because otherwise they won't be actually having enough intake to support their healthy growth and development. So I think I would come back with that. Yeah, but great question.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Widen. Really appreciate it. And our next speaking session is led by Marina Chaparro. Marina is a nationally recognized dietitian, nutrition, and diabetes expert, media spokesperson, and author specializing in pediatric and family nutrition. She was the author of Diabetes and Pregnancy from the American Diabetes Association and founder and CEO of NutriChicos, a bilingual pediatric nutrition practice that helps parents transform their children's nutrition by celebrating culture, fostering connection, and bringing joy back to the table. She's known for translating science into practical, relatable advice, which features in outlets like Parents Magazine, Washington Post, and Univision. Marina holds degrees from both Boston University and Florida International University. Marina is originally from the border town of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, and now lives in Miami, Florida. Everyone, please welcome Marina Chaparro.
Well, it is a joy to be here. I think this topic couldn't come at a better time. And I can tell you that as a Latina pediatric registered dietitian, I am absolutely thrilled to be with all of you. So let's get started. So what if I told you that by 2050, 1 out of every 3 kids born in the US will be Hispanic? 1 out of 3. So before we can really help this population, we need to understand it. And hopefully by today, we will do just that. And the problem that I often see is when I tell you, what is healthy eating for kids? If you had to picture an image, if you had to Google it, what would be those pictures that come to mind? Well, I just did that. I put in Pinterest, healthy kids food. And what did I find? I found usually a very Pinterest perfect image of what we think feeding kids should look like. But what if feeding kids could also look like this? Could be some rice, some beans, maybe some pork, some ejotes, some meat, some aguacate. What if that definition could also look like that? So what if you're a first-time mom living in Phoenix and you have a provider that is asking the right questions and saying, well, what do you eat as a family? What did you grow up eating? And they can tell you, great, why don't we start with maybe las lentejas, the beans, the rice, the pork, the meat. And I can tell you, as a Latina mom, I remember the first time that I gave my daughter beans. And this is Alicia, right here in the video, who was eating beans the first time when I was back home in the border town.
When in the border town, we're eating beans.
And I can just remember my sense of pride.
And your food?
And every time that I still see my kids eating tacos, enjoying some nopales, and I hear it from other of my parents, especially because they might not live in their own cultural, in their own city that their parents grew up. They're in the US. So what if, we could start reimagining and we can start challenging this narrative about what we think kids' nutrition should look like and change the message to one that celebrates culture. We instill curiosity and we focus on balance, on joy, on connection. So I think if you're a parent, I think you will relate because feeding, it is not easy. Feeding, and especially feeding in today's world, could be really challenging. And what are some of the challenges that we face as parents? Well, there's a lot. Too much information. I mean, I was just at a conference to say about only 4% of all health messages in TikTok are actually accurate. 4%, not surprising. We also know from Dr. Widen's presentation that we want to close this gap, right? Those first 1,000 days really, really matter. We'll talk a little bit more about that. What about the myths and misperceptions, especially if we're dealing with Hispanic families, whether it's starting solids, whether it's dairy? We do know that Hispanics tend to have the highest rates of food insecurity, not to mention disparities and health disparities, but also obesity. And there's this cultural disconnect because we do not eat the same thing. So why are we giving the same recommendations to all parents? If you have questions, if you're working with Hispanics, I really want to get to know what these challenges are. So maybe we can have a discussion if times allow. So 4 key things that we're going to talk about here. First, why those 1,000 days matter, and just kind of review a little of the information that Dr. Widen just beautifully said. Then I have something that I say, but I'm Latin, right? That cultural disconnect, that there's so many cultural feeding practices among Hispanics that we need to understand them first. Then this idea that health should be chicken, brown rice, and broccoli. But what if it's not? What if health could be different and we could start thinking of other ways that we can enhance nutrition in a practical way? And lastly, how can we become culturally curious? How can we get our clients to trust us and make it work for them? So at the end of the day, I think what most parents are really struggling with is a key question. Am I a good parent? I've heard it from experts. I've heard it from parents. All of us, deep down, all of our doubts, our fears go back to this. If my kid does not like broccoli, am I still a good parent? If I get my kids cereal and milk for dinner, am I a good parent? And I'll share with you some of my moments of doubt. There have been plenty of them. But I remember when I started feeding solids with my daughter, Emma Lucia. And I had this image, right? I was the expert. I was the pediatric expert. I was doing this for a while, so I knew it all. And then I had her. And I thought, based out of my Pinterest and my Instagram, that she would look like this. She would just start feeding solids and it would be beautiful. The reality was quite different. So not interested at all, complete disappointment. And after doing this for a long time, my conclusion is this. You're a good parent. There's no right way to feed kids. So let's get started why those first 1,000 days matter. As Dr. Widen just said, we know that the time that they, from birth until the second birthday, is really, really, really important. And what else is happening here? Well, it's not just the birth, but it's the maternal and prenatal conception. If moms don't have access to food, well, the baby is starting off one step behind. We know that the brain is working. We also know that taste preferences develop. So they also mention, is food for one just for, is it just for fun? Well, actually, take aside the nutrition, taste preferences will develop. Eating habits could develop as early as 3 years of age. So therefore, we really want to prioritize every bite in these first 1,000 days. So which of the following nutrients are critical for brain's development, especially in the first 1,000 days? We have iodine, we have zinc or iron, or all of the above. I'm going to put some Jeopardy music. Dun, dun, dun. And you answered correctly. It is all of the above. Now for question number 2. An infant's brain doubles by 1 year, reaching around 80% growth by age 2. True or false? True. So the baby requires specific nutrients for their growth. We talked about protein, the zinc, the heme iron, the iodine, the folate, the choline. And so guess where all of these nutrients might be? They're going to be a lot of the times an animal-based product. And that is why they're very important. And as I was saying, I was just at a conference last week. And one of the messages that parents really resonated with is brain health. Because why? Everybody wants their babies to be the next Einstein. So when I tell a parent, did you know that 80% of your child's brain will already be developed by age 2 or 3? And that's why these key nutrients we really want to prioritize. So again, zinc, selenium, iodine, choline. And it's not just the nutrition, but let's talk about price. Let's talk about affordability, versatility. 22 cents per serving when we're talking about milk. So it's really hard to beat, not just from a nutrition point, but also versatility and affordability. Cultural disconnect. But I'm Latina. This is my version of Selena saying, let's understand this. So there's interesting social cultural feeding practices that are happening here. So whether it's a chunky baby, we'll talk about a few, whether it's a chunky baby, whether it's solid introduction, the idea of food is love, feeding to soothe, the importance of family. And here I would love to know if you're familiar with them, if maybe you've heard some of these. So chunky baby, a lot of the times in Hispanic culture, we perceive that a chunky baby will be a healthier baby. In fact, the research indicates that Latina moms often can incorrectly perceive their children to be at appropriate weights. And I saw this when my daughter was first born. My mother-in-law, that I love her so much, she would say, that baby's too skinny. We need to feed that baby more, right? So it's ingrained in how we view health, because we also know that the cultural perceptions of weight, of diet can change depending on cultures, right? We want our women to have curves in Hispanic culture. When we're talking about solids, some research, although we need a lot more, so I'm so glad we're hearing Dr. Widen's talk, Latinos tend to start solid introduction earlier. And 2 interesting facts. We know breastfeeding appears to protect against early introduction of solids. But unfortunately, Latina moms tend to exclusively breastfeed for less time. Oftentimes I've heard it anecdotally because maybe we believe that our milk is not sturdy enough and we need to kind of complement with something else. So we need to understand them. So which food is most common among Hispanics to be given as a first food? We have bananas, we have soups, meat, and rice.
¿Qué comes?
Again, that's my daughter. Soups. This was a little interesting for me as well. And I will say that the caveat that the research here was mostly in Mexican American. And we know that Latinos are not a monolith. So I think that's why it could vary significantly, and we still don't know the data. But for Mexican Americans, soups made from chicken broth or even like bean broth that would include a little veggies. But interestingly enough, beef was introduced at around 13 to 15 months later because parents believe that meat and beans can be harder to digest. So I will give them a soup, but just with the broth, not with the actual food. So really interesting. And we also noticed that baby cereals and veggies were perceived to be good options because of the WIC education that they received. So awesome there. So what are some of the common concerns related to meat? Well, some parents would say the nutrition, like, is this healthy? Other parents would say, how do I even prepare this? How do I go about it? Is it safe, right? What about the taste and the preferences? Food is love for Hispanics, and that is a cultural belief that many cultures have, but especially for Hispanics and Latinos. And this idea of we're feeding to soothe, or we're using food as a bribe or reward, we see interesting studies actually coincide with this. So whether the baby is crying and I want to feed that baby because I want to soothe them, and it's hard for me to just let them cry, that emotional component, letting to permissive feeding, maybe a looser meal structure, and or even using it as a bribe, right? So I love this quote from this focus group that a mom said, if you want to be like Talia, and if you know who Talia is, like a telenovela star, just eat your veggies, right? So that bribe has been ingrained so early on from our parents. And the lack of continual exposure. And this is not just Hispanics. We see that from many married parents, that if I introduce broccoli by the first or second time, and if they don't like it, I give up, right? We know that the opposite. Kids need around 14, 15 introductions. And when it comes to trust, moms believe that providers would not understand if they chose not to follow the infant feeding recommendations. So I'm not going to ask you, because I know I might feel judged. So the issue is not, in fact, an awareness or lack of information, because they know that certain foods are healthy, but rather how applicable are those recommendations, right? So again, maternal feeding practices are impacted by cultural views. Food is love. Permissive feeding practices, lack of schedule, family dynamics, respect matters, and there's a lot of solid myths to dispel. So health is a lot more than just chicken and brown rice, right? So how do we optimize nutrition in these first years? So when it comes to first foods, right, we know that beef, pork, are high quality protein sources of choline, of zinc, heme iron, B12. Lentils, beans, a cultural staple, right? Good source of fiber. What about avocados, those sprinklers of food? Full fat yogurt, so versatile, not to mention great source of probiotics. So it's talking about how can we adapt that family meal, right? So quick examples. Maicena or oatmeal. We could do whole milk with little sprinkles like flax seeds, linasas. Arepa, my kid's favorite, just adding a protein, whether it's an egg, cheese. Batidos, really popular source of smoothies that we could do frozen fruits, right? Whether it's lunch and dinner, how can we add nutrition? If it's a quesadilla, great. Could we add some mushrooms? Could we add some spinach? Oh, and so a lot of the times we also know that pork pairs really well with traditional foods, and it's also a carrier food, so they're more likely to consume underrepresented foods. So there's multiple ways of introducing. It's a matter of education. You want to do baby-led weaning? Fabulous. Then let's do maybe some really moist meat, or maybe we do it in a ground picadillo. And guess what? That is what the family is already eating. So when it comes to dairy, right? So many ways of introducing it, whether it's a quesadilla, in a smoothie, full-fat yogurt, a cheese. So it's simple ways of adapting it. So we're focusing on adding, not eliminating. El plato balanceado, adding boosters, native fruits and veggies, and including the family. And lastly, how can we be culturally curious, right? Is there such a thing as being truly competent? Culturally competent? I don't think so. I think we're always learning. But some things that we want to consider are, do they trust you? Where are they getting the information? Where did you hear that? Or what do you think about that? So we know that, again, the maternal grandmother is really important that first year of life. But interestingly, afterwards in preschool, then healthcare providers become much more important. So they do trust the providers, but they also want to respect their parents, especially if they're also helping with taking care of their kids. So I was a pediatric certified diabetes educator for many years, and I got very frustrated. And I had this agenda, and I wanted to cover this and help my kids with type 1 diabetes. And oftentimes I would get nowhere. And then I started asking and learning which questions to ask. And sometimes the most effective one was, if I had a magic wand, what could be one thing that I would help you today? So sometimes it's just about asking the right questions and forgetting your agenda. So instead of maybe, again, thinking all Hispanics eat the same thing, you might not know the answers because, trust me, I do not know them as well, and I'm Mexican. Ask. Assuming tortillas and white rice are unhealthy, thinking of ways to add nutrition. Please do not tell my patients to use a cauliflower tortilla, but rather add cauliflower next to the tortilla. Realizing health could look very different. And of course, we want to involve the family. So our job is to close those gaps, resolve myths. We want to provide evidence-based recommendations, and again, make it work for them. So imagine if we could empower Latino parents to raise a generation of kids who can enjoy tortillas, broccoli, even chocolate without guilt or tricks, because at the end, food is more than nutrients. Food is family, food is culture, food is love. And with that, I leave you to it, and we'll open it up for questions.
This one looks like it's a question for Dr. Widen. Is there data about dairy and if toddlers meet protein recommendations from that food group?
I'm not 100% sure if the data were presented that way in the dietary guidelines, but if you give me like 3 minutes, like circle back to me in like a minute and I can check. So
Okay, sounds great. Okay, and then we'll go to a question for Marina then here. Okay, so do you recommend any recipe sources for a non-Hispanic practitioner looking to grow in culturally relevant and authentic cuisine experiences to help guide Hispanic patients, families in nutritious and acceptable meal planning?
I love this because most providers are not going to be Hispanic, and I think that's totally fine. But we can still be culturally relevant. So, and maybe we can add this in maybe some of the sources. So I know that WIC also has lots of recipes, and even in like Mi Plato, they have lots of recipes of how to culturally adapt it. I'm trying to think off the top of my head because there are a lot of resources, but it's just kind of having them where you need them. So WIC for sure. Lorena Drago has an amazing book, who's also a diabetes care and education specialist, on culturally foods. And that includes a lot of different from Hispanic. So it could be Caribbean, it could be Mexican, it could be Cuban, and that could also impact. But maybe we can get back to you and give you a little list. You know that if you go to my place, you'll also find some culturally relevant kind of pediatric focus as well in NutriChicos. But that's important to have top of mind. So it's just like a good resource of people that are already doing the work.
Awesome. And then Dr. Wyden, can we come back to you
yeah,
on
sure.
that? Okay.
And I also think for recipes, like Texas WIC also has a lot of recipes I think. And then a lot of the table foods, I think, can also be modified for babies and just depend, like, and I don't know if Marina really got into this about like the spiciness versus not, but like it just depends on the baby if they'll accept spicy food or not. So you can also just give them just baby appropriate size infant foods. So in terms of the current intakes, so the way that dairy is presented in the current intakes, it might have been on the first slide that I talked about like how we're doing about the recommended ranges for the 12 to 23 month age group. But basically for dairy, the average intakes are like well above the recommended intake ranges. And so this is probably highlighting that a lot of children ages 12 to 23 months are likely drinking, meeting that dairy requirement either from cheese, yogurt, and then also probably a lot of milk. And it isn't the way that it's presented, it's split up into the protein foods versus dairy foods. And so I think it's a little bit tricky to like specifically look at how they contribute to protein because the way that it's presented is just in a slightly different way based, I think, on the way that the recommendations split up the different nutrient and food groups. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll shift gears over to Marina. What to do as a parent when they start to poke out the veggies out of the food? I already diced it in small pieces, but they are like hawks and see it.
Yes, and for me, it's about trust because oftentimes we're kind of told to like kind of trick them or tell them it's really chicken when it's actually fish. That works. Disguising them works for a limited time. Really, my focus would be on how can you get your child comfortable in playing around that carrot. So if your child is picking with carrots, I would say let's get him in the kitchen. Let's get him familiarized and actually touching, seeing, because for many kids, it's actually a texture issue. So before we expect kids to eat it in their plate, they need to see it outside their plate. And oftentimes as parents, we just say, here, eat it, have the carrot. And they're like, wait, what is this? I've never seen this in my life. What do you mean? So we need to take 2 steps back, not having to trick them because they're going to outsmart you, but starting to build a positive connection with carrots, whether it's making carrot muffins with some Greek yogurt, whether it's making a soup, whether it's a salad, whether it's some hummus. So just starting to change the mindset of we think veggies are just horrible, and teaching kids these are different ways of eating them. Yes, in a muffin, beautiful, delicious.
I also think maybe having like a little, like instead of giving like a ton of carrots, just giving like one on the plate and like having like a special section of the plate sometimes for just like that one food that you might want to like nudge them towards, but like they don't have to eat it, just putting it there, that also can potentially increase acceptance as well.
All right, very good. This one I think could be for both of you. When do you suggest meats and proteins in infants? Like suggest feeding it?
6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think like early and sustained introduction and repeated exposure across infancy, I think is really important, especially because I didn't really get into this in my talk, but like, you know, children are much more likely to accept foods when they're a bit younger, and then they begin to have more strong opinions as they get a little bit older. And so if they're already consuming the protein-rich foods regularly across infancy, that increases their likelihood of accepting it in that second year of life and then beyond.
Exactly. And that's the slide that I had to take off. It's actually called the taste window, where babies are going to accept everything. And if you have a parent, you're like, oh my God, they eat everything. And when they turn about a year and a half, they're like, nope. So that taste window is going to be really important. So we want to introduce, you name it, all of it, texture, variety, flavor, spice. I mean, and that's, again, a teaching point for parents of the more variety you can give during this time period, which is 6 months to about a year, the more likely some research has said that they're going to accept that food even after 6 years of life.
Wow, that's awesome. Glad you covered it now.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. All right, next question here. For measuring iron in breastfed babies, aligning with animal products, where the mother's diet taken into account with the data?
Okay, so that's a great question. At least in terms of like the levels of nutrients in milk, like the levels of micronutrients, particularly iron, are relatively stable and are not really greatly influenced by mom's diet. Other nutrients like fatty acids are much more reflected from the mom's diet, but for iron in particular, it really isn't influenced strongly by diet and mom.
So thank you, Dr. Widen, thank you, Marina, thank you everyone who collaborated in making this webinar.